On the morning of January 11, 1992, two hunters discovered what they initially believed was a discarded mannequin on a rural Indiana road. When they stepped closer, the horrifying truth became clear. It was the charred, mutilated body of a child, posed deliberately, her face and hands burned beyond recognition in a calculated attempt to prevent identification. What those hunters could not have known in that moment was that this wasn't the work of an adult predator or a hardened criminal. The person responsible for this unspeakable act of cruelty was a 16-year-old girl, and she hadn't acted alone. Before we continue, I want you to comment below. If you discovered that someone you loved was capable of this kind of violence, would you turn them in? Would you be able to accept what they had become? The victim was 12-year-old Shanda Renee Scherer, a cheerful middle schooler who loved basketball and volleyball. The perpetrators were four teenage girls, aged 15 to 17, who spent an entire night torturing her before burning her alive. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of lost control. This was methodical. This was sustained. This was 8 hours of deliberate, escalating brutality that would shock the nation and force us to confront an uncomfortable question. What turns children into killers? To understand what happened that night, we must first understand the girls who committed this crime. Because the truth is far more disturbing than simple evil. These were not monsters born in darkness. They were products of systematic abuse, neglect, and psychological damage that had been building for years. And perhaps most terrifying of all, they were capable of appearing completely normal to the outside world. Melinda Loveless was born on October 28, 1975. In New Albany, Indiana. To neighbors and acquaintances, the Loveless family might have seemed unremarkable, perhaps even respectable. Larry Loveless was a Vietnam War veteran who had achieved the rank of sergeant. He was treated as a hero upon his return. But behind closed doors, the Loveless household was a chamber of horrors that would systematically destroy the psyche of every person living within it. Larry Loveless was not simply an abusive father. He was a sexual deviant whose perversions knew no boundaries. He would wear his wife's and daughter's underwear and makeup. He was incapable of monogamy, yet possessed a twisted mixture of jealousy and fascination with watching his wife engage in sexual acts with other men and women. This wasn't occasional behavior. This was the foundation of their family dynamic. Marjorie Loveless, Melinda's mother, was both victim and unwilling participant in this nightmare. Larry would take her to bars in Louisville, where he would pretend to be a doctor or dentist and introduce her as his girlfriend, not his wife. He would then share her with his friends from work, acts she found disgusting but felt powerless to prevent. During one particularly horrific incident, Larry orchestrated a gang rape of his own wife while their daughters were in the house. Afterward, Marjorie attempted to drown herself. When she refused to have sex with him for a month following this trauma, Larry raped her while their daughters listened through a closed door, fully aware of what was happening to their mother. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being a child, lying in your bed, hearing your mother being violated by your father. What does that do to a developing mind? How does a child process that level of trauma? The abuse extended far beyond Marjorie. Court testimonies would later reveal that Larry had fondled Melinda as an infant. He had molested Marjorie's 13-year-old sister early in their marriage. He had molested the girl's cousin, Teddy, from age 10 to 14. Melinda's older sisters both claimed he had molested them, though Melinda herself never admitted to being sexually abused by her father. What we do know is that she slept in bed with him until he abandoned the family when she was 14 years old. Larry's abuse wasn't limited to sexual violence. He was verbally abusive to all his daughters. When Melinda's older sister Michelle was 7 years old, Larry fired a handgun in her direction, intentionally missing her. He would find his daughter's underwear and smell it in front of other family members, a deliberate act of humiliation and psychological torture. He was violent with Marjorie, beating her so severely on one occasion that she required hospitalization. He was convicted of battery for that assault. The financial instability added another layer of chaos to the household. Larry worked irregularly, spending any money he earned on himself, usually purchasing firearms, motorcycles, and cars. The family filed for bankruptcy in 1980. Extended family members described the marriage as loveless and noted that the daughters would visit their homes appearing hungry, apparently not receiving adequate food at home. For 2 years, beginning when Melinda was 5, the family became deeply involved in the Graceland Baptist Church. Larry and Marjorie gave full confession and renounced their previous lifestyle. Larry became a Baptist lay preacher. Marjorie became the school nurse. To the congregation, they must have seemed like a family redeemed, proof that faith could overcome any obstacle. But the darkness never truly left. The church arranged for Melinda to be taken to a motel room with a 50-year-old man for a 5-hour exorcism. Think about that. A 5-year-old child, already traumatized by the chaos in her home, taken to a motel room with a strange adult man for 5 hours. What happened in that room? What additional trauma was inflicted under the guise of spiritual healing? Larry's true nature eventually revealed itself even within the church community. He became a marriage counselor and acquired a reputation for being too forward with women. He eventually attempted to rape one of them. After that incident, the loveless parents left the church and returned to their former lifestyle of drinking and sexual deviance. In November 1990, Larry was caught spying on Melinda and a friend. Marjorie attacked him with a knife. He was sent to the hospital after attempting to grab it. Marjorie then attempted suicide again. Her daughters called authorities. After this incident, Larry filed for divorce and moved to Avon Park, Florida. For Melinda, this abandonment was crushing. Despite everything he had done, despite all the abuse and trauma, she felt devastated when he left. He remarried shortly after, which deepened her sense of rejection. He sent letters to her for a while, but eventually severed all contact. Would you have felt abandoned if your abuser left? Or would you have felt relief? The psychology of abuse is complex and counterintuitive. Victims often maintain emotional attachments to their abusers, especially when that abuser is a parent. Melinda's entire sense of self had been shaped by her father's presence, no matter how toxic. His absence left a void that she had no healthy way to fill. By 1990, at age 15, Melinda Loveless was a deeply damaged young woman. She had been exposed to sexual deviance from infancy. She had witnessed her mother being raped and beaten. She had been subjected to psychological torture and humiliation. She had been abandoned by the father she had slept beside for 14 years. She had no framework for healthy relationships, no understanding of appropriate boundaries, no ability to process her emotions in constructive ways. And then she met Amanda Heavrin. Amanda Heavrin was 13 years old when she began dating 15-year-old Melinda Loveless in 1990. For Melinda, this relationship became everything. It was the first source of affection and validation she had experienced outside her toxic family environment. Amanda represented safety, acceptance, and love in a life that had contained precious little of any of those things. But Melinda's understanding of love had been warped by her upbringing. She had learned from her father that love meant possession, control, and jealousy. She had learned that relationships were transactional and often violent. She had no model for healthy attachment or appropriate boundaries. As 1991 progressed, Melinda's behavior became increasingly erratic. She got into fights at school. She reported feeling depressed and received professional counseling. In March 1991, she came out to her mother as a lesbian, following in the footsteps of her two older sisters. Her mother was initially furious but eventually accepted it. However, acceptance at home did not translate to stability in Melinda's mind. Her relationship with Amanda began to deteriorate. The reasons are not entirely clear, but what is evident is that Melinda's grip on the relationship was loosening, and she could feel it slipping away. For someone whose entire emotional foundation was built on sand, this loss of control was intolerable. Then, in the fall of 1991, Amanda Heavrin met Shanda Scherer. Shanda Renee Scherer was born on June 6, 1979, in Pineville, Kentucky. By all accounts, she was a normal, happy child. After her parents divorced, her mother remarried, and the family moved to Louisville, Kentucky, where Shanda attended 5th and 6th grades at St. Paul School. She was on the cheerleading, volleyball, and softball teams. She was social, athletic, and well-liked. In June 1991, after her mother divorced again, the family moved to New Albany, Indiana. Shanda enrolled at Hazelwood Middle School. Early in the school year, she transferred to Our Lady of Perpetual Help School, a Catholic school in New Albany, where she joined the girls' basketball team. She was 12 years old, navigating the normal challenges of adolescence. New schools, new friends, the confusion of emerging romantic feelings. Shanda met Amanda Heavrin early in the fall semester at Hazelwood Middle School. Their first interaction was a fight that Heavrin started with Scherer. Both girls ended up in detention for the altercation. But something happened during that detention. They talked, they connected, they became friends. And then, as sometimes happens in early adolescence, those feelings deepened into something more romantic. They began exchanging letters. In late October 1991, Heavern took Scherer as her date to a school dance. For two young girls exploring their identities and feelings, this was likely exciting and meaningful. For Melinda Lovelace, it was a declaration of war. Lovelace found them at the dance and confronted Scherer. The exact nature of that confrontation is not fully documented, but it was significant enough that Scherer understood she had made an enemy. Although Heavern and Lovelace never formally broke up, Lovelace began dating an older girl. But her obsession with Shanda Scherer was only beginning. After Heavern and Scherer attended a festival together in late October, Lovelace began openly discussing killing Scherer. She threatened her in public. Think about that. A 16-year-old girl was openly talking about murdering a 12-year-old, and no one took it seriously enough to intervene. Scherer's parents became concerned about the situation and arranged for her to transfer to a Catholic school in late November, hoping that physical separation would resolve the problem. Amanda Heavern would later claim that she gave letters Lovelace had sent her, containing death threats toward Scherer, to a youth prosecutor. But the youth prosecutor never did anything about it, as far as she knew. If this is true, it represents a catastrophic failure of the system. A child was making explicit death threats against another child, and the adults who were supposed to protect them did nothing. Would you have taken those threats seriously? Or would you have dismissed them as teenage drama? How many warning signs do we ignore because we cannot imagine that children are capable of such violence? Melinda Lovelace did not act alone. She recruited 3 other girls to help her carry out her plan: Laurie Tackett, Hope Rippey, and Toni Lawrence. Each of these girls brought their own history of trauma and dysfunction to that terrible night. Mary Lauren Tackett, known as Laurie, was born on October 5, 1974, in Madison, Indiana. Her mother was a fundamentalist Pentecostal Christian. Her father was a factory worker with 2 felony convictions from the 1960s. Tackett claims she was molested at least twice as a child, at ages 5 and 12. In May 1989, her mother discovered that Tackett was changing from a dress into jeans at school. That night, during a confrontation about this perceived transgression, her mother attempted to strangle her. Social workers became involved, and Tackett's parents agreed to unannounced visits to ensure that child abuse was not occurring. But the damage had already been done. Tackett and her mother continued to have periodic conflicts. Tackett's mother was deeply involved in fundamentalist Christianity and became alarmed when she learned that Hope Rippey's father had purchased a Ouija board for the girls. She went to the Rippey house and demanded that the board be burned and that the house be exorcised. This extreme religious environment, combined with the physical abuse and the earlier sexual abuse, created a perfect storm of psychological instability. After her 15th birthday, Tackett became increasingly rebellious and fascinated with the occult. She would often attempt to impress her friends by pretending to be possessed by the spirit of Diana the vampire. This was likely a coping mechanism, a way to feel powerful and in control when her actual life was chaotic and frightening. But it also suggests a disconnection from reality, a willingness to inhabit a fantasy world where normal rules did not apply. In early 1991, Tackett began dating a girl who was involved in the occult. She also began engaging in self-harm. Her parents discovered the self-harm and checked her into a hospital on March 19, 1991. She was prescribed an antidepressant and released. 2 days later, with her girlfriend and Toni Lawrence, Tackett cut her wrists deeply and was returned to the hospital. After treatment of her wounds, she was admitted to the hospital's psychiatric ward. During this hospitalization, Tackett was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. She confessed that she had experienced hallucinations since she was a young child. She was discharged on April 12. She dropped out of high school in September 1991. By October, she was staying in Louisville with various friends. There she met Melinda Lovelace. The two became friends in late November. Think about what was happening here. 2 deeply damaged teenage girls, both with histories of abuse, both with mental health issues, both disconnected from stable family structures, found each other. In December, Tackett moved back to Madison on the promise that her father would buy her a car. But she still spent most of her time in Louisville and New Albany, and by December, she spent most of it with Lovelace. Hope Anna Rippey was born in Madison on June 9, 1976. Her father was an engineer at a power plant. Her parents divorced in February 1984, and she moved with her mother and siblings to Quincy, Michigan, for 3 years. She claimed that living with her family in Michigan was somewhat turbulent. Her parents resumed their relationship in Madison in 1987. She was reunited with friends Tackett and Tony Lawrence, whom she had known since childhood, although her parents saw Tackett as a bad influence. Like the other girls, Rippey began to self-harm at age 15. Tony Lawrence was born in Madison on February 14, 1976. Her father was a boilermaker. She was close friends with Rippey from childhood. She was abused by a relative at age 9 and raped by a teenage boy at age 14. The police only issued an order for the boy to keep away from Lawrence. She began attending counseling after the incident, but did not continue. She became promiscuous, began to self-harm, and attempted suicide in 8th grade. Do you see the pattern? Every single one of these girls had been traumatized. Every single one had been failed by the adults in their lives. Every single one was engaging in self-destructive behaviors that were clear cries for help. And every single one was ignored until it was too late. On the night of January 10, 1992, Tony Lawrence, Hope Rippey, and Laurie Tackett drove from Madison to Melinda Lovelace's house in New Albany. Rippey and Lawrence had not previously met Lovelace. Upon arrival, they borrowed some clothes from Lovelace. Then Lovelace showed them a knife and told them she was going to scare Shara with it. This is the moment where everything could have stopped. 3 girls who had never met Shanda Shara were being shown a weapon and told about a plan to frighten a 12-year-old child. Any one of them could have said no. Any one of them could have left. Any one of them could have called the police. But they didn't. Tackett already knew of the plan to murder Shara. Lovelace explained to Rippey and Lawrence that she disliked Shara for being a copycat and for stealing her girlfriend. The language is important here. Lovelace framed Shanda as someone who had wronged her, someone who deserved punishment. She was creating a narrative that justified what they were about to do. Tackett let Rippey drive the 4 girls to Jeffersonville, where Shara stayed with her father on the weekends. They stopped at a McDonald's restaurant to ask for directions. They arrived at Shara's house shortly before dark. Lovelace instructed Rippey and Lawrence to go to the door and introduce themselves as friends of Amanda Heavrin. Shanda Shara answered the door. Rippey and Lawrence told her that Amanda was waiting for them at the witch's castle, a ruined stone house on an isolated hill overlooking the Ohio River. Shara was reluctant to go out. She told them she had a party to attend. She suggested the girls come back around midnight. This was Shanda's last chance to save herself. If she had refused to go with them at all, if she had woken her father, if she had been more insistent, she might have lived. But she was 12 years old. She had no reason to suspect that these girls, who claimed to be friends of Amanda, meant her any harm. She was trusting in the way that children are trusting. Lovelace was angry when Rippey and Lawrence returned without Shara, but they assured her they would come back. The 4 girls crossed the river to Louisville and attended a punk rock show at the Audubon Skate Park. Lawrence and Rippey quickly lost interest in the music and went to the parking lot, where they engaged in sexual activities with 2 boys in Tackett's car. Think about the psychology of this moment. These girls were about to commit murder, and they stopped to attend a concert and have casual sexual encounters. This suggests a level of dissociation, an inability to fully grasp the reality of what they were planning. Or perhaps it suggests something even more disturbing, that they were so damaged, so disconnected from normal human empathy that the impending violence simply did not register as real or significant. Eventually, the 4 girls left for Shara's house. During the ride, Lovelace said that she could not wait to kill Shara. However, she also said she just intended to use the knife to frighten her. Was this true? Was Lovelace still telling herself that she was only going to scare Shanda? Or was she lying to the others, easing them into what was about to happen? When they arrived at Shara's house at 12:30 in the morning, Lawrence refused to retrieve Shara. So Tackett went with Rippey to the door instead. Lovelace hid under a blanket in the back seat of the car with the knife. Shanda's father and stepmother had gone to bed and allowed Shanda to stay downstairs to watch television. When Rippey told her that Amanda was still at the witch's castle, Shanda was reluctant but agreed after changing her clothes. As they got in the car, Rippey began asking Shanda questions about her relationship with Amanda. Then Lovelace sprang out from the back seat, put the knife to Shanda's throat, and began interrogating her about her sexual relationship with Heavrin. The nightmare had begun. They drove toward Utica and the witch's castle. Tackett told the girls that a local legend said the house was once a castle owned by 9 witches, and that the townspeople burned down the house to get rid of the witches, leaving a small stone house in its place. This detail is chilling. Tackett was creating atmosphere, building a narrative, turning this into a story rather than a reality. It was a form of psychological distancing, a way to make what they were doing feel less real. At the witch's castle, they took a sobbing Shanda inside and bound her arms and legs with rope. Lovelace taunted her, saying that she had pretty hair and wondered how pretty she would look if they were to cut it off. This terrified Shanda even more. Lovelace began taking off Shanda's rings and handing them to the girls, like trophies, like souvenirs. At some point, Rippy took Shanda's Mickey Mouse watch and danced to the tune it played. Let that image sink in. A 12-year-old girl, bound and terrified, watching as her captors took her possessions and danced. The casual cruelty of this moment is almost incomprehensible. It suggests a complete absence of empathy, a total inability to recognize Shanda as a human being with feelings and fears. Tackett further taunted Scherer, claiming that the witch's castle was filled with human remains and that Shanda's would be next. To further threaten her, Tackett retrieved a shirt with a smiley design from the car and lit it on fire. But she immediately feared that the fire would be spotted by passing cars, so the girls left with Shanda. During the car ride, Shanda continued begging them to take her back home. Can you imagine the terror she must have felt? She was 12 years old, bound, surrounded by older girls who were threatening her life. She must have been praying that this was just a cruel joke, that they would eventually let her go, that someone would save her. No one did. They became lost and stopped at a gas station, covering Shanda in a blanket. While Tackett went inside to ask for directions, Lawrence called a boy she knew in Louisville and chatted for several minutes to ease her worries. But she did not mention Shanda's abduction. This is another moment of profound moral failure. Lawrence was frightened enough to need reassurance, but not frightened enough to stop what was happening. They returned to the car, became lost again, and pulled up to another gas station. Lawrence and Rippy spotted a couple of boys and talked to them before getting back into the car. Again, multiple opportunities to stop this. Multiple moments where someone could have asked for help. But they didn't. They arrived at the edge of some woods near Tackett's home in Madison. Tackett led them to a dark abandoned building off a logging road in a densely forested area. Lawrence and Rippy were frightened and stayed in the car. This is where the torture began in earnest. Lovelace and Tackett made Shanda strip down to her underwear. Then Lovelace beat Shanda with her fists. She repeatedly slammed Shanda's face into her knee, which cut Shanda's mouth on her own braces. Lovelace tried to slash Shanda's throat, but the knife was too dull. Rippy came out of the car to hold Shanda down. Lovelace and Tackett took turns stabbing Shanda in the chest. They strangled her with a rope until she was unconscious. Then they placed her in the trunk of the car and told the other two girls that Shanda was dead. But she wasn't. The girls drove to Tackett's nearby home and went inside to drink soda and clean themselves. When they heard Shanda screaming in the trunk, Tackett went out with a paring knife and stabbed her several more times. She came back a few minutes later covered with blood. Shanda Scherer had been beaten, cut, stabbed, and strangled. She had been left in the trunk of a car, bleeding and terrified, and she was still alive, still conscious, still screaming for help. After Tackett washed, she told the girls' futures with her runnerstones. This detail is particularly disturbing. They had just brutally attacked a child, and Tackett was playing with occult objects, pretending to see the future. It suggests a complete disconnection from reality, an inability to grasp the enormity of what they had done. At 2:30 in the morning, Lawrence and Rippy stayed behind as Tackett and Lovelace went country cruising, driving to the nearby town of Canaan. Shanda continued to make crying and gurgling noises, so Tackett stopped the car. When they opened the trunk, Shanda sat up, covered in blood with her eyes rolled back in her head, but unable to speak. Try to imagine this moment. A 12-year-old girl, brutalized beyond comprehension, sitting up in a trunk, her eyes rolled back, unable to speak but still alive, still fighting to survive. Tackett beat her with a tire iron until she was silent. She later claimed that she felt Shanda's head caving in. She told Lovelace to smell it. They also sexually assaulted Shanda with the same weapon. The tire iron assault continued off and on for hours as the girls went on a joyride through the countryside. They were driving around, listening to music, chatting, while a dying child lay in their trunk, her skull fractured, her body broken. What were they thinking during those hours? Were they thinking at all? Or had they entered a state of complete dissociation? where the reality of what they were doing simply did not register. Loveless and Tackett returned to Tackett's house just before daybreak to clean up again. They woke up Rippy and Lawrence. Rippy asked about Shanda, and Tackett laughingly described the torture. She laughed. Tackett's mother woke up, initially angry with her daughter for being out so late. But she also offered to cook the girls some breakfast. Tackett declined and said she needed to drive the other girls home. Tackett's mother had no idea that there was a dying child in the trunk of her daughter's car, just outside her house. Instead of taking the girls home, Tackett drove to the burn pile. They opened the trunk to look at Shanda. Lawrence refused. Rippy suddenly sprayed Shanda with Windex and taunted her, asking if she was not looking so hot now. Shanda had been tortured for hours. She had been beaten, stabbed, strangled, and bludgeoned with a tire iron. Her skull was fractured. She was barely alive. And one of her tormentors sprayed her with cleaning fluid and mocked her appearance. The girls drove to a gas station near Madison Consolidated High School. They pumped gasoline into the car and bought a 2-liter bottle of Pepsi. Tackett poured out the Pepsi and refilled the bottle with gasoline. They drove north of Madison, past Jefferson Proving Ground to Lemon Road off U.S. Route 421. Lawrence remained in the car while Tackett and Rippy wrapped Shanda, who was still alive, in a blanket and carried her to a field by the gravel country road. Rippy poured some of the gasoline on Shanda. Then they set her on fire. Loveless was not convinced Shanda was dead, so they returned a few minutes later to pour the rest of the gasoline on her. Shanda burned to death in a field in rural Indiana. She was 12 years old. She had been tortured for 8 hours. And in her final moments, as the flames consumed her, she was alone. At 9:30 in the morning, the girls went to a McDonald's restaurant for breakfast. They laughed about Shanda's badly burned body looking like one of the sausages they were eating. They laughed. Lawrence then phoned a friend and told her about the murder. Tackett dropped off Lawrence and Rippy at their homes and returned to her own home with Loveless. Loveless told Amanda Heavrin that they had killed Shanda and arranged to pick her up later that day. A friend of Loveless, Crystal Wathen, came over and they told her what had happened. Then the 3 girls drove to pick up Heavrin and take her back to the Loveless home where they told her the story. Both Heavrin and Wathen were reluctant to believe the story until Tackett showed them the trunk of the car with Shanda's bloody handprints and socks still present. Heavrin was horrified and asked to be taken home. When they pulled up in front of her house, Loveless kissed her, told her she loved her, and pleaded with her not to tell anyone. Heavrin promised she would not before entering her house. Think about Amanda Heavrin's position in this moment. She was 13 years old. The girl she had been dating had just confessed to murdering another girl, a girl Amanda had been friends with, a girl who had been killed because of Amanda's relationship with both of them. She was terrified, she was traumatized, and she was being asked to keep this secret. Later that morning, 2 brothers from Cannon, Don, and Ralph Foley were driving toward Jefferson Proving Ground to go hunting when they noticed a body on the side of the road. They initially thought it was a mannequin, but upon exiting the vehicle, they realized it was clearly the burned body of a child. They called the police at 10:55 in the morning. State Trooper David Cam and Jefferson County Sheriff Buck Shipley and detectives began an investigation, collecting forensic evidence at the scene. They initially suspected a drug deal gone wrong and did not believe the crime had been committed by locals. The body was posed in a suggestive position, very obviously done on purpose and with intention. The victim's face and hands were burned in an attempt to keep her unrecognizable and unidentifiable. She was found in the pugilistic stance with her arms outstretched and clenched fists, a result of death by burning. Shanda's father, Stephen, noticed his daughter was nowhere to be found early on January 11th. After phoning neighbors and friends all morning, he called his ex-wife at 1:45 in the afternoon. They met and filed a missing person report with the Clark County Sheriff. At 8:20 that evening, Lawrence and Rippy went to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office with their parents. They both gave very rambling statements, identifying the victim as Shanda, naming the 2 other girls involved as best as they could, and describing the main events of the previous night. Detectives obtained dental records that positively identified Shanda as the victim. Loveless and Tackett were arrested on January 12th. The bulk of the evidence for the arrest warrant came from the statements made by Lawrence and Rippy. All 4 girls were charged as adults. To avoid the death penalty, they accepted plea bargains. Tackett and Lovelace were sentenced to 60 years in the Indiana Women's Prison. Rippey was sentenced to 60 years, with 10 years suspended for mitigating circumstances, plus 10 years of medium supervision probation. On appeal, a judge reduced her sentence to 35 years. In exchange for her cooperation, Lawrence was allowed to plead guilty to 1 count of criminal confinement and was sentenced to a maximum of 20 years. The mitigating factors were significant. Some of the girls had troubled home lives, with claims of physical or sexual abuse committed by a parent or other adult. Lawrence, Rippey, and Tackett all had histories of self-harm. Tackett was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and had been suffering from hallucinations. Lovelace had the most extensive history of abuse and mental health issues. But here is the question that haunts this case. Does understanding why someone commits a crime excuse the crime itself? Does knowing that Melinda Lovelace was systematically abused and traumatized throughout her childhood make what she did to Shanda, Sharer, any less horrific? The answer, of course, is no. Understanding is not the same as excusing. Explanation is not the same as justification. Shanda Sharer was an innocent child who was tortured and murdered. Nothing that happened to Melinda Lovelace, or Laurie Tackett, or Hope Rippey, or Tony Lawrence changes that fundamental fact. But understanding the context does force us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we fail children. Every single one of these girls showed clear signs of severe trauma and psychological distress. Every single one of them was engaging in self-destructive behaviors that should have triggered immediate intervention. Every single one of them was failed by the adults who were supposed to protect them. Melinda Lovelace was sleeping in bed with her abusive father until she was 14 years old. Where were the teachers who should have noticed? Where were the relatives who knew what was happening? Where were the social workers who should have intervened? Laurie Tackett's mother attempted to strangle her, and social workers became involved, but the abuse continued. She was hospitalized for self-harm and diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, then released back into the same dysfunctional environment. She dropped out of high school and no one seemed to care. Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence were both engaging in self-harm at age 15. Lawrence had been raped at age 14, and the police response was simply to tell the boy to stay away from her. She attempted suicide in 8th grade. Where was the follow-up? Where was the intensive therapy? Where was the safety net that should have caught her? These girls were screaming for help in every way they knew how, and no one was listening. And then, when their pain and rage finally exploded outward instead of inward, we acted shocked. We called them monsters. We locked them away. Were they monsters? Or were they children who had been so thoroughly broken by the adults in their lives that they no longer knew how to be human? Lawrence was released from prison on December 14, 2000, after serving 8 years. Rippey was released on April 28, 2006, after serving 14 years. Tackett was released in January 2018, after serving 26 years. Lovelace was released in September 2019, after serving 27 years. When these releases were announced, there was public outcry. How could these women who had committed such a brutal crime be allowed to walk free? How could they be given a second chance when Shanda Sharer never got one? These are valid questions. The pain of Shanda's family is unimaginable and ongoing. Her mother, Jacqueline Vaught, has spoken publicly about her grief and her opposition to the releases. She has every right to feel that justice was not served, that no amount of prison time could ever balance the scales for what was taken from her daughter and from her family. But here is another uncomfortable question. What is the purpose of our justice system? Is it purely punitive, designed only to inflict suffering on those who have caused suffering? Or is there also a rehabilitative component, a belief that people can change, that even those who have committed terrible crimes can, with time and treatment, become different people? The women who were released from prison are not the same as the teenage girls who committed this crime. They have spent decades in prison. They have received therapy and treatment. They have, by all accounts, expressed genuine remorse for what they did. Does that matter? Should it matter? There is no easy answer to these questions. The tension between justice and mercy, between punishment and rehabilitation, between protecting society and offering redemption, is one of the fundamental dilemmas of criminal justice. And in cases like this, where the crime is so horrific and the victim so innocent, that tension becomes almost unbearable. The Shanda Sharer case attracted international attention due to both its brutality and the young age of the perpetrators. It was covered on national news and talk shows. It has inspired numerous episodes on fictional crime shows. It has been the subject of books and documentaries. But what have we learned from it? We have learned that children are capable of extraordinary cruelty. We have learned that abuse and trauma can create cycles of violence that are difficult to break. We have learned that warning signs are often ignored until it is too late. But have we actually changed anything? Are we better at identifying and helping traumatized children? Are we more willing to intervene in abusive households? Are we more serious about mental health treatment for adolescents? The evidence suggests that we are not. Children are still being abused. Teenagers are still engaging in self-harm at alarming rates. Mental health services for young people are still inadequate and underfunded. We continue to fail the children who need us most. The Shanda case should have been a wake-up call. It should have forced us to examine how we treat troubled youth, how we respond to signs of abuse, how we provide mental health services. Instead, it became a sensational story, a cautionary tale, a source of morbid fascination. We looked at Melinda Loveless, Loree Tackett, Hope Rippey, and Tony Lawrence and called them monsters. We did not look at the systems that failed them. We did not look at the adults who ignored their suffering. We did not look at ourselves. There are questions about this case that will never be answered. What was Shanda thinking during those 8 hours of torture? Did she understand why this was happening to her? Did she believe until the very end that someone would save her? What were Melinda Loveless and Loree Tackett thinking as they beat and stabbed and burned a 12-year-old child? Were they thinking at all? Or had they entered a state of dissociation so complete that they were no longer fully present in their own actions? What would have happened if any one of the adults in these girls' lives had taken their trauma seriously? What if Larry Loveless had been arrested for child abuse? What if Loree Tackett had received intensive treatment after her hospitalization? What if someone had followed up on Tony Lawrence after her rape? What if Hope Rippey's parents had been more vigilant about her friendships? Would Shanda still be alive? We cannot know. We can only look at what happened and try to understand it, try to learn from it, try to prevent it from happening again. But the truth is that cases like this continue to happen. Children continue to be abused. Teenagers continue to commit acts of violence. The cycle continues. The final question. The Shanda case forces us to confront the darkest aspects of human nature. It forces us to acknowledge that children, even young children, are capable of extraordinary cruelty. It forces us to recognize that abuse and trauma can warp a developing mind in ways that are difficult to predict and even more difficult to treat. But it also forces us to confront our own failures. Our failure to protect vulnerable children. Our failure to take warning signs seriously. Our failure to provide adequate mental health services. Our failure to break cycles of abuse before they produce new victims. Shanda was an innocent child who died in unimaginable pain and terror. Nothing can change that. Nothing can bring her back. Nothing can ease the suffering of her family. But we can choose to honor her memory by doing better. By paying attention to the children around us who are suffering. By taking threats seriously. By providing resources for mental health treatment. By intervening in abusive situations. By refusing to look away when it would be easier to do so. The question is not whether we understand what happened on that terrible night in January 1992. The question is whether we care enough to prevent it from happening again. Do we? Or will we continue to fail the children who need us most, until another Shanda dies at the hands of another group of broken, traumatized teenagers who were screaming for help that never came? The answer to that question will determine whether this case was a tragedy we learned from or simply another horror story we tell ourselves, to feel superior to the monsters we created.